The first thing you need to understand about me is this: I don't cause trouble, but I prepare for it. That lesson was drilled into me by my grandfather, a quiet man who survived 3 brutal winters living off the land. He used to say, "The world doesn't warn you before it turns cold. You either prepare, or you pay." So when I bought my modest home on the edge of a pristine lake, tucked behind a row of luxury houses managed by the HOA, I did what I always do. I prepared. Every fall, I stocked up. Firewood stacked neatly under a reinforced shed. Canned food organized by date. Emergency heaters. Fuel containers sealed tight. Everything legal. Everything safe. Everything mine. And every year, my neighbors looked at me like I was crazy. Especially her. Her real name didn't matter. Everyone called her Karen. Not behind her back. To her face. She had earned it. Karen was the self-appointed queen of the HOA. Blonde hair pulled tight like it was angry at her scalp. Sunglasses even when it was cloudy. Clipboard always tucked under her arm like a weapon. She didn't walk, she marched. She lived in one of the lakefront mansions. Marble driveway. Heated pool. Glass walls facing the water. Her house looked like it belonged in a luxury real estate commercial. Mine, simple. Practical. Quiet. That difference alone made me a target. It started small. A note on my door: unapproved storage structure. Remove immediately. I checked the HOA bylaws. My shed was allowed. I ignored it. Then came the fines: $100, then $200, then $500. Each notice cited vague aesthetic violations. I appealed, they denied. Karen made sure of that. One afternoon, as I was stacking firewood, I felt eyes burning into my back. I turned around and there she was, standing at the edge of my property line, arms crossed, lips curled like she'd just smelled something rotten. "You can't keep all that," she snapped. I wiped my hands on my jacket. "It's winter stockpile. Perfectly legal." She scoffed. "This is a community, not a survivalist compound." I smiled. "Tell Winter that." Her face tightened. "You think rules don't apply to you," she said. "We'll see about that." That was the moment I realized this wasn't about rules, it was about control. Over the next week, HOA trucks drove past my house more often. Inspectors stopped randomly. Karen herself showed up twice, pretending to take phone calls while staring at my shed. Then came the night everything changed. It was late October. The air had that sharp, metallic chill that tells you snow isn't far away. I was inside when I smelled it. Smoke. Not the comforting smell of a fireplace, this was wrong. Bitter. Chemical. I ran outside. My shed was on fire. Flames crawled up the wooden walls like hungry animals. The stacked firewood crackled and popped, sending sparks into the dark sky. The heat hit my face like an open oven. I grabbed the hose, heart pounding, hands shaking. As water hit the flames, something inside me snapped, not fear, not panic. Rage. The fire department arrived fast. Too fast. Almost like someone had already been waiting to make the call. They put it out. But the damage was done. Half my winter stockpile, gone. Thousands of dollars. Months of preparation. Reduced to blackened ash and warped metal. The fire chief pulled me aside. His voice dropped low. "This wasn't an accident," he said. "Accelerant was used." My stomach dropped. Someone did this. And deep down, I already knew who. The next morning, Karen was waiting for me. She stood by her mailbox, sipping coffee, watching me survey the ruins of my shed. When our eyes met, she didn't look away. In fact, she smiled. "Such a shame," she said, walking over. "Those structures were a fire hazard. HOA warned you." My hands clenched into fists. "You burned my shed," I said quietly. She gasped, placing a manicured hand on her chest. "How dare you accuse me of something so serious?" Her eyes glittered. She was enjoying this. "You people think you can hoard and hide like the rules don't apply," she continued. "This community values appearance, safety, order." I stepped closer. "You destroyed my property." She leaned in, lowering her voice so only I could hear. "Prove it." Then she straightened, smiled sweetly, and walked back to her luxury home by the lake. That night, I sat in the dark, staring at the water beyond my backyard. The lake was calm, reflecting the moon like a sheet of glass. Beneath that peaceful surface lay something most of the HOA residents didn't even know existed. The spillway. A reinforced flood control channel built decades ago, designed to protect the entire neighborhood during extreme storms. It ran from the upper reservoir, through my section of land, and into the lake. It was rarely used. Almost forgotten. But I knew it well. Because when you prepare for winter, you learn everything about your land. I stood there, the smell of smoke still clinging to my clothes, listening to the quiet lapping of water against the shore. Karen thought she'd won. She thought burning my stockpile would force me to bend. To sell. To leave. She had no idea what she'd just ignited. And as winter clouds rolled in overhead, one thought echoed in my mind. If they wanted a disaster so badly, maybe it was time they experienced one. The spillway gate sat silent in the darkness. The morning after the fire felt colder than it should have. Not just the air, but everything else. The neighborhood was quiet in that strange, uncomfortable way, like everyone knew something bad had happened but didn't want to acknowledge it. The smell of burn wood still lingered around my property, mixing with the damp scent of the lake. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at what remained of my winter stockpile, replaying Karen's smile over and over in my head. I didn't report her. Not yet. I knew how this worked. HOA politics thrived on technicalities and plausible deniability. If I accused her without proof, I'd become the problem. The difficult homeowner. The unstable one. Karen would make sure of that. She lived for moments like this. Instead, I documented everything. Photos. Videos. Close-ups of the burn patterns. The melted plastic containers. The fire department report mentioning accelerant. I uploaded copies to the cloud, emailed them to myself, and saved them on a hard drive. Preparation wasn't just about food and fuel. It was about leverage. 2 days later, the first official HOA letter arrived. This one wasn't about the shed. It was about non-compliant landscaping and unauthorized modifications near the waterline. I laughed out loud when I read it. They were reaching now. Karen was pushing, testing how far she could go. At the next HOA meeting, she made sure to sit front and center. The room was filled with polished smiles, designer jackets, and the faint smell of expensive perfume. I stood out in my plain coat, still smelling faintly of smoke. Karen took the floor like she was stepping onto a stage. She talked about safety. About community standards. About how certain individuals endangered property values by refusing to comply with rules meant to protect everyone. As she spoke, her eyes flicked toward me again and again. When the meeting ended, a few neighbors approached me quietly. Not too close. Not too openly. "I heard about your shed," one man whispered. "That was awful." Another woman shook her head. "She's been on a power trip lately." But when I asked if they'd speak up, they looked away. Fear has a way of keeping people silent, especially when their houses are worth more than they'll ever admit. That night, the weather alert came in. Heavy rainfall expected. Severe storm system moving in from the north. Potential flooding in low-lying areas. Most people ignored it. They always did. The lake had never flooded in their lifetime. The spillway had never been used. To them, it was just another line in a report. To me, it was a calculation. I walked down to the spillway access point just before dusk. The gate was old but well-maintained, reinforced steel with a manual override. The water behind it was already higher than usual, swollen from earlier rains. I placed my hand on the cold metal and felt the pressure behind it. Not dangerous yet, but close. I went back inside and checked my supplies. What little I had left was secured indoors now. I adjusted sandbags I'd quietly placed along my foundation weeks earlier. No one had noticed. They never did. Prepared people are invisible until it's too late. The next morning, rain began to fall. At first, it was gentle. Almost peaceful. A soft tapping against the windows. The kind of rain that makes people feel cozy in their million-dollar homes. Karen probably sat by her floor-to-ceiling windows, coffee in hand, admiring the view. By afternoon, it intensified. Sheets of rain blurred the lake into a gray smear. The wind picked up, pushing waves against the shoreline. My phone buzzed with another alert. Flash flood warning. Reservoir levels rising faster than expected. That was when Karen showed up again. She stood at the edge of my driveway, raincoat perfectly tailored, hair untouched by the weather. "You need to remove those sandbags," she shouted over the rain. "They're not HOA approved." I stared at her, water dripping from my hood. "They're on my property," I replied. "They're an eyesore," she snapped. "And if they redirect water, you'll be liable." I almost laughed. Almost. "You should be more worried about your own property," I said calmly. Her eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening me?" "No," I said. "I'm warning you." She scoffed and turned away, heels sinking slightly into the wet ground as she walked back toward her mansion. The rain didn't stop. By evening, the lake level had risen noticeably. The spillway alarm system, silent for decades, let out a low mechanical hum. Barely audible. But I heard it. I watched from my porch as HOA members scrambled, making frantic calls, posting updates in the community group chat. Karen was suddenly everywhere online, assuring everyone that everything was under control. "It always is," she wrote. "No need to panic." But panic has a way of seeping in, just like water. Around midnight, I got the notification I'd been expecting. Reservoir approaching critical threshold. Protocol dictated the spillway be opened partially to relieve pressure. Normally, that decision required HOA coordination with the city. Normally, paperwork delayed everything. But this time, the storm wasn't waiting for permission. I put on my boots and stepped back into the rain. The wind howled now, bending trees and rattling fences. As I approached the spillway, the water roared behind the gate, angry and impatient. I hesitated. This wasn't revenge. Not yet. This was safety. The spillway existed for a reason. If it wasn't open soon, the pressure could cause structural failure upstream. That would flood everything. Including my home. I unlocked the manual control. The metal wheel was stiff, resistant, like it hadn't been touched in years. I put my weight into it, muscles straining as it slowly began to turn. Water surged forward, testing the opening. I stopped. Just enough. Enough to follow protocol. Enough to protect the reservoir. Enough that no one could accuse me of wrongdoing. But I knew something the HOA didn't. The luxury homes were built right where the spillway's overflow naturally spread before modern barriers were added. Barriers that hadn't been inspected in years. Barriers weakened by neglect and arrogance. As the gate opened slightly, water began to rush through the channel, controlled but powerful. I stood there, rain plastering my clothes to my skin, watching the flow head toward the lake. In the distance, lights flickered on in the mansions. Doors opened. People stepped outside, confused. Karen's house was the closest. I closed the control box, locked it, and walked back home. Behind me, the water kept moving. And somewhere in the storm, the first crack formed in the illusion that money could protect them from consequences. By morning, everyone would understand what happens when pressure is ignored for too long. And Karen? She was about to learn that some rules are written by nature. And nature never loses. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid, but because the storm had a voice now, and it was impossible to ignore. The rain hammered the roof like 1,000 impatient fingers, and every so often, I could hear the deep, distant roar of water moving through the spillway channel. It wasn't violent yet, but it was confident. Purposeful. Like it knew exactly where it was going. Just before dawn, my phone started buzzing nonstop. HOA group chat. At first, the messages were confused. Is anyone else seeing water near the lake road? Why is the level rising so fast? Did the city open something? Then the tone shifted. Water is in my backyard. My pool is overflowing. Is this normal? I sat at my kitchen table, coffee steaming in my hands, watching the messages stack up like dominoes falling in real time. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It was an awakening. As daylight broke through the storm clouds, I stepped outside. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, but the damage was already in motion. The lake had expanded beyond its usual shoreline, creeping into manicured lawns and over decorative stone borders. Water flowed where it always had before humans tried to tell it not to. Down the slope, near the spillway exit, the old concrete barriers were failing. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough to let water slip through the cracks and follow gravity's rules. I grabbed my rain jacket and walked toward the lake. The first luxury home I passed had water licking at the edge of its patio. Expensive outdoor furniture sat half-submerged, cushions floating like abandoned life rafts. The owner stood there in disbelief, phone pressed to his ear, voice raised in panic. This wasn't supposed to happen, he kept saying. Karen's house came into view next. Her glass walls reflected the gray sky, but the scene inside was chaos. I could see her through the windows, pacing, gesturing wildly at someone on the phone. Water had reached the base of her sliding doors. The pristine white stone floor inside was now streaked with muddy footprints where she and her husband rushed back and forth. She spotted me. Even through the rain and distance, I could see her expression shift. Confusion. Recognition. Then something darker. She stormed outside, heels forgotten, barefoot on the wet ground. "What did you do?" she screamed, rain soaking her perfectly styled hair. I stopped a few feet away, keeping my voice calm. "I followed protocol," I said. "Spillway was open to relieve pressure. You should be grateful." Her face twisted. "You did this on purpose." I shook my head. Nature did this. The system worked exactly as designed. Water surged a little higher, as if punctuating my words. Behind her, alarms began to sound inside the house. The kind designed for leaks and flooding. The kind she probably never thought she'd hear. She turned back toward her home, shouting orders at her husband, then spun back to me. "This is your fault," she said, voice cracking now. "You'll pay for this." I looked past her, at the row of mansions along the lake, each one now dealing with the same reality. "You already made me pay," I said quietly. "Remember my shed?" Her eyes flickered. Just for a second. But it was enough. She said nothing more and ran back inside as water spilled over her threshold. By mid-morning, emergency vehicles lined the street. City officials, engineers, and insurance adjusters arrived, their shoes sinking into mud as they assessed the situation. The spillway was still flowing, controlled and steady. Exactly what it was meant to do. The problem wasn't the spillway. The problem was everything built too close to it. I was questioned, of course. Everyone was. When an engineer asked to access the spillway controls, I raised my hand. "I did," I said. The alarm indicated critical pressure. Manual override was necessary. He nodded, checking his notes. "You prevented a larger failure upstream." Those words echoed in my head. Prevented a larger failure. Karen stood nearby, arms wrapped around herself, soaked in silent. For once, she didn't interrupt. Didn't argue. Didn't demand to see bylaws. The storm clouds finally broke apart by afternoon, sunlight glinting off flooded lawns and rippling water. It was almost beautiful, in a tragic way. Like watching a truth surface after being buried for too long. That's when the insurance reality hit. One by one, homeowners realized their policies didn't cover flood damage from spillway overflow. Some tried to argue it was a mechanical failure. Others claimed negligence. The city's response was simple. The spillway functioned correctly. The storm exceeded historical norms. The properties were built in a known overflow zone. Karen's house took the worst hit. Her ground floor was ruined. Custom cabinetry warped. Marble flooring cracked. The heated pool overflowed, undermining part of the foundation. She stood in her driveway as contractors assessed the damage, her world collapsing in slow motion. And then she saw me again. This time, there was no anger. No fire. Only fear. "You could have warned us," she said quietly, voice barely above a whisper. I met her gaze. "You burned my winter stockpile." Silence hung between us, heavy as the damp air. "I needed that to survive the winter," I continued. "You took that from me because you didn't like how it looked." Her eyes dropped to the ground. For the first time, Karen looked small. That night, as the neighborhood settled into an uneasy quiet, the HOA emergency meeting was called. Attendance was mandatory. Tempers were high. Voices were raised. Blame flew in every direction. When Karen tried to take control, no one listened. People talked over her. Questioned her decisions. Brought up past complaints. Fines. Threats. Her reign, built on intimidation, cracked under pressure just like the barriers by the spillway. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. The water had already told my story for me. As I walked home under a clearing sky, stars beginning to peek through, I felt something I hadn't felt since the fire. Relief. Not because they suffered, but because balance had been restored. And deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. Because consequences don't stop at water damage. They keep flowing. The floodwater receded faster than anyone expected, but what it left behind was far worse than mud and warped flooring. It left questions. Uncomfortable ones. And questions have a way of digging deeper than any investigation ever could. 2 days after the storm, the neighborhood looked like a construction zone. Dehumidifiers hummed behind shattered glass doors. Fans roared day and night. Dumpsters lined the streets, overflowing with ruined furniture, soaked rugs, and pieces of people's carefully curated lives. The luxury illusion was peeling away, and underneath it was panic. The HOA scheduled another emergency meeting, this time in the community clubhouse because Karen's living room was uninhabitable. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. I arrived early and sat in the back. I wasn't hiding. I just didn't need the spotlight. Karen, on the other hand, walked in late, wearing a borrowed coat and shoes that didn't quite fit. She looked exhausted. Not just physically, but mentally. Like someone who had spent years holding up a heavy crown and finally felt it slipping. The meeting started badly and only got worse. Homeowners demanded answers. Why hadn't the spillway barriers been inspected? Why were homes approved so close to a known overflow zone? Why had repeated storm risk assessments been ignored? At first, Karen tried to deflect. She blamed the city. The engineers. The unprecedented weather. But this crowd wasn't the same one she'd intimidated for years. These were people staring at repair bills that rivaled their mortgage payments. Then someone stood up. It was the quiet man from 3 houses down. The one who never spoke at meetings. "I'd like to know," he said calmly, "why our HOA rejected funding for spillway reinforcement 3 times over the last decade." The room went silent. Karen froze. The man continued, holding up printed documents. These were public records. HOA meeting minutes. Signed approvals. all overridden by the HOA president. All eyes turned to Karen. She opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time, she had no prepared speech. Another homeowner spoke up. Then another. They had emails, notices, records of complaints dismissed without review, safety reports ignored in favor of cosmetic upgrades like decorative lighting and imported landscaping. Every decision pointed to the same conclusion. Karen hadn't just been enforcing rules. She'd been reshaping the neighborhood to fit her image, no matter the risk. And then my name came up. Someone asked why my shed had been targeted so aggressively. I felt the room shift toward me, curiosity replacing hostility. I stood. I followed every regulation, I said evenly. When I appealed the fines, they were denied without explanation. When my shed burned down, the fire department confirmed it was arson. Gasps rippled through the room. Karen snapped her head toward me. That's a lie. Is it? I replied calmly. Because I have the report. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse her directly. I didn't need to. The board members exchanged looks. One of them cleared his throat. This is the first we're hearing of an arson report, he said. That's because it was never shared, I replied. Just like the spillway reports. The meeting ended abruptly. Not because there were answers, but because there were too many questions. The next week was a slow-motion collapse. The city launched a formal review of the HOA's governance. Insurance companies demanded documentation. Lawyers got involved. Karen received letters. Lots of them. The kind that arrive in thick envelopes and make people's hands shake. She stopped coming outside. Her husband avoided eye contact. The HOA website went offline for maintenance. And then, one afternoon, there was a knock on my door. It was Karen. She looked nothing like the woman who once marched around with a clipboard. Her hair was loose. Her makeup gone. Her voice unsteady. I need to talk, she said. I stepped aside and let her in. She looked around my home, at the practical furniture, the neatly organized shelves, the repaired storage area where my shed once stood. You were ready, she said quietly. For everything. I didn't respond. She swallowed. They're blaming me. The board. The homeowners. Even my lawyer says I might be personally liable. I met her eyes. You are. She flinched. I didn't think it would go this far, she whispered. I just wanted things to look perfect. That's the problem, I said. You cared more about appearances than people. She nodded slowly, tears welling up. I burned your shed, she said. The words hung in the air. I knew if you stayed, others would start pushing back. You didn't fit the image. I panicked. I exhaled slowly. Why come here? I asked. Because, she said, voice breaking, you're the only one who knows the system better than anyone. The spillway. The land. I need your help. I studied her for a long moment. The woman standing in front of me wasn't powerful anymore. She was scared. Stripped of authority. Facing consequences she could no longer bully away. I can't help you escape responsibility, I said finally. She nodded. I know. She turned to leave, stopping at the door. For what it's worth, she said, I'm sorry. I watched her walk back toward her damaged home, shoulders hunched under the weight of her own choices. That evening, I received an email from the city. The spillway investigation concluded that my actions had prevented catastrophic upstream flooding. I was cleared of all liability. Commended, even. I closed my laptop and sat back, listening to the quiet. The water was gone. But the reckoning had just begun. Because when power is abused for too long, it doesn't just crack. It collapses. By the time winter fully arrived, the neighborhood no longer felt like the place it once was. The polished confidence was gone. The quiet arrogance had been replaced with caution, suspicion, and something closer to humility. Lawns that were once trimmed to perfection now sat half-frozen and neglected. Construction crews came and went, but progress was slow. Money was draining faster than the floodwater ever had. And Karen was unraveling. The HOA board called one final meeting before the holidays. Not an emergency meeting this time. A reckoning. Attendance wasn't just mandatory, it was packed. People stood along the walls, arms crossed, faces hard. No one chatted. No one smiled. Karen sat at the front, no clipboard, no confidence. Just a stack of papers and trembling hands. The board chair cleared his throat and spoke carefully, like a man stepping through a minefield. He outlined the findings of the city's investigation. Negligence. Ignored safety recommendations. Unauthorized override of funding decisions. Abuse of authority. Each word landed heavier than the last. Then came the vote. Karen was removed as HOA president. No drama. No shouting. Just a quiet, unanimous decision. The silence afterward was louder than any argument she'd ever won. She didn't protest. She didn't cry. She simply nodded, as if some part of her had known this moment was coming for a long time. She gathered her papers slowly, stood up, and walked out of the room without looking back. I watched her go, feeling something unexpected. Not victory. Closure. In the weeks that followed, more truths came out. The arson investigation moved forward once insurance companies got involved. Surveillance footage from a nearby property surfaced. Grainy, but clear enough. A figure. Late at night. A familiar posture. A car registered to Karen's household. She was charged. Not arrested in handcuffs like people imagine, but charged all the same. Fines. Probation. Mandatory restitution. The kind of punishment that follows you quietly, relentlessly, into every future decision. Her luxury home went on the market before winter ended. Price slashed. Then slashed again. No one wanted the house closest to the spillway. As the first snow fell, I rebuilt my shed. Stronger. Safer. Fully compliant, inspected, and approved by the new HOA leadership. No fines. No complaints. In fact, one board member stopped by personally to thank me for my preparedness and my restraint. Most people would have acted out of anger, he said. I shrugged. I acted out of necessity. Winter hit hard that year. Harder than most remembered. Roads iced over. Power outages rolled through neighboring towns. Deliveries were delayed for weeks at a time. But I was ready. Neighbors who once looked down on my preparation now knocked on my door asking where I bought my generator. How I insulated my pipes. What kind of heater worked best. I helped them. All of them. Even the ones who stayed silent when my shed burned. Especially them. Because survival isn't about proving a point. It's about community. One evening, as snow piled high and the lake froze solid, I stood outside and looked across the quiet neighborhood. Lights glowed softly behind windows. Smoke curled from chimneys. The spillway lay frozen and silent again, doing what it always had. Waiting. Karen's house was dark. A for sale sign stood half buried in snow, creaking in the wind. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt balance. She tried to control what she didn't understand. She punished preparation because it threatened her illusion of perfection. And when pressure built, when reality pushed back, the system responded exactly as it was designed to. Not with revenge. With consequences. That's the thing people forget. Karma doesn't need anger, IT doesn't need planning, IT doesn't even need intent. It just needs time. And pressure. As I went back inside, shutting the door against the cold, I thought about my grandfather's words. You either prepare, or you pay. Karen paid. The neighborhood learned. And me? I was already ready for whatever came next. Spring didn't arrive gently that year. It came like a reckoning, melting snow too fast, exposing everything that had been buried for months. Cracks in driveways. Water-stained siding. Foundations that had shifted just enough to cause worry. The kind of damage you don't notice until the thaw forces you to look closely. The neighborhood was quieter now. Not peaceful, cautious. Conversations were shorter. Smiles felt measured. People had learned something over the winter, and no one wanted to say it out loud. Power doesn't protect you, preparation does. The new HOA board worked differently. Slower. Transparent. Almost awkwardly honest. Meetings were no longer performances. They were uncomfortable, messy, and real. Questions were answered instead of dismissed. Safety reports were actually read. And for the first time since I'd moved there, the spillway became a topic of open discussion instead of an ignored footnote. Engineers came again. This time, with funding approved. Reinforcements were planned. Overflow zones were remapped. Some homeowners learned their properties should never have been approved the way they were. There was anger. Lawsuits. Finger-pointing. But there was also acceptance. Because denial only works until reality knocks. One afternoon, while repairing a section of fence damaged by frost heave, I noticed a familiar car pull up slowly across the street. It stopped. The engine stayed running for a moment. Then it shut off. Karen stepped out. She looked different. Not just older, lighter. Like someone who had finally stopped pretending to be someone else. She wore simple clothes now. No heels. No sunglasses. Just jeans and a jacket. She stood there awkwardly, clearly debating whether to approach. I waited. Eventually, she walked over. "Hi," she said. "Hi," I replied. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The lake behind us shimmered in the spring sun, calm and innocent, like it hadn't changed lives just months earlier. "I sold the house," she said quietly. I nodded. "I heard. I'm moving inland. Smaller place. No HOA." There was a hint of a laugh in her voice. Bitter, but real. "I wanted to say goodbye," she continued. "And, thank you." I raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For not destroying me when you could have," she said. "For letting the system do what it was meant to do." I thought about that for a moment. "I didn't open the spillway for revenge," I said. "I opened it because it needed to be opened." She nodded. "I know that now." She hesitated, then added, "I spent years controlling everything because I was terrified of losing control." I looked at the spillway access path cutting through the land, now reinforced and clearly marked. "Control is an illusion," I said. "Preparedness isn't." She smiled faintly. "I hope you're ready for the next storm," she said. "I always am." She turned and walked back to her car, pausing once to look at the neighborhood one last time. Then she drove away, leaving behind nothing but tire tracks and a chapter that was finally closing. As spring deepened, something unexpected happened. The neighborhood started to change, not physically, but culturally. People shared information now. Not gossip, but knowledge. Who had extra supplies? Who had medical training? Who could help if power went out again? It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. Organic. The spillway became a symbol. Not of disaster, but of humility. A reminder that no matter how expensive your house is, you live on borrowed land. Land that remembers water. Land that will always choose its own path. One evening, as I walked along the lake, a kid from 2 houses down ran up to me. "My dad says you saved the neighborhood," he said proudly. I smiled. "Your dad gives me too much credit." "But you knew," the kid insisted. "You were ready." I ruffled his hair. "That's something you can learn too." He ran off, shouting to his friends. I stood there a while longer, watching the sun dip low, turning the water gold. The spillway lay quiet again, reinforced, respected, understood. I realized then that the real flood hadn't been water. It had been truth. And once truth flows through a system long enough, it changes everything it touches. The neighborhood would never go back to what it was. And that was a good thing. Because pretending everything is perfect is far more dangerous than admitting you're not ready. As I headed home, tools in hand, I felt the calm confidence that comes from knowing one simple thing. Whatever comes next, storm, winter, pressure, I won't be caught off guard. And neither will they. Time has a strange way of smoothing the sharpest edges. By the time summer returned, the neighborhood had almost healed. Almost. You could still see faint water lines on a few garage walls if you knew where to look. A couple of driveways sloped just a little differently now. Subtle reminders that the land had spoken once, and could speak again. Life moved on. But it didn't forget. On the 1-year anniversary of the storm, the HOA held a community gathering by the lake. Nothing fancy. No speeches about property values. Just folding chairs, kids running around, and neighbors actually talking to each other. Real conversations. The kind that used to feel impossible. Someone suggested a toast. To preparedness, a man said, raising his cup. And to humility, someone else added. Laughter followed, light but sincere. I stood near the water, watching ripples spread across the surface. The spillway sat quietly in the background, reinforced, maintained, and no longer ignored. A silent guardian instead of an inconvenient detail. A neighbor approached me, new to the area. Young couple. Nervous smiles. We heard the story, the woman said carefully. About what happened here. I nodded. Her partner added, we're building a shed. For supplies. We wanted to make sure, it's okay. I smiled. It's more than okay. It's smart. They looked relieved, like they'd just been given permission to think for themselves. As the sun dipped low and the gathering began to wind down, I took one last look around. The lake. The homes. The people. Everything looked calm. Peaceful. But peace doesn't come from pretending danger doesn't exist. It comes from respecting it. Karen's name still came up occasionally, usually as a cautionary tale. Not with hatred. Not even with anger. Just understanding. She had tried to dominate a system that demanded balance. And balance always wins in the end. I never heard from her again. And that was okay. Because this story was never really about her. It was about preparation versus pride, reality versus image, pressure versus denial. Most people think karma is dramatic. Loud. Explosive. But real karma is quiet. It doesn't scream, it doesn't threaten, it simply waits until the conditions are right. And then it flows. Just like water. As I walked home that evening, the sky darkened slightly, clouds rolling in on the horizon. A distant rumble of thunder echoed, faint but familiar. I smiled. Not because I wanted another storm. But because I was ready. And now, so were they. The spillway would do its job if needed, the neighborhood would face reality together, and no one would ever burn someone else's winter stockpile just because it didn't fit an image. Some lessons come through fire, others come through water. The important thing is that they come. And when they do, you can either fight them or learn. I unlocked my door, stepped inside, and shut the world out for the night. Outside, the lake rested quietly.